We should be back here by about 5 o'clock this evening, guys, so we will be stopping then when we come back through this little village, alright? But as I was saying, guys, they were afraid to execute Eamon de Valera because he was an American citizen. He was released from prison, and on his release he hooked up with a friend of his, a man called Michael Collins. Michael Collins had fought beside Eamon de Valera down in the bakery, and the two men had become very, very close. But they went on fighting for independence in this country. Even though the rebellion was a failure, the independence war was still going on. And in 1921, the news broke that the English had had enough of the Irish. They were going to hand the land of Ireland over to the Irish. Michael Collins was appointed as the man to go and agree and sign the treaty. He signed that treaty in 1921, but he wasn't happy with the treaty at all. The deal was that the English would hold on to a part of Ireland. Some of the Irish agreed with it, some had disagreed with it. When this treaty was signed, civil war broke out in this country, even though the independence war had finished. Again, the Irish were fighting amongst themselves. Civil war. Michael Collins went to Dublin Castle in 1922. He was the man sent there to accept the handover of land from the English to the Irish. On the day the ceremony took place, he was actually late. The senior British officer conducting the ceremony on the day approached Michael Collins and said, "Where have you been? You've kept us waiting." And his answer to that was, "But I've only kept you waiting a short time. You have kept us waiting a couple of 100 years." This ceremony eventually took place. The handover of land was given to the Irish, and the Free State was born. And that is why today we have two separate jurisdictions on this island. Civil war was in full swing in 1922. The Irish were still at each other's throats. Michael Collins was travelling home to a family wedding in County Cork, and on the way to that wedding they came upon an anti-treaty ambush, a little place called Bale-na-Blaw, and in Bale-na-Blaw he was shot dead. When his funeral took place, they say that over 1 million people lined the streets of Dublin to pay their respects to Michael Collins. He was known as the big man. He was 6'4", but he is buried today up in Glasnevin Cemetery on the north side of the city of Dublin. To give you an idea of the size of this cemetery, there are over 1.5 million people buried in that cemetery today. And 103 years after his death, the graveside of Michael Collins is still the most visited graveside in that graveyard. Absolutely crazy, but it's true. After the breakup of this country into two separate jurisdictions, guys, the Catholics in Northern Ireland who were beginning to feel repression from the Protestants in Northern Ireland were looking down their noses at the Catholics. Catholics were not allowed to have decent education or have decent jobs that paid good money. They were not entitled to social housing. They could not work for the Crown of England. In fact, if you were a Catholic in Northern Ireland up until 27 years ago, if you were a Catholic in Northern Ireland, you were not allowed to be a member of the police force. How crazy is that? Because of your religion, you were not allowed to be a member of the police force. Absolutely mental. Down here in the south of the island, the Free State as it was known, things were a little bit different. It was relatively calm. The religious orders of the day had a lot of power with the government. In fact, I will go as far as to say that the government used to do what they were told by the religious orders. The people of this country were, again I will say, afraid of the religious orders because they had so much power. You might have heard of this country being described as Holy Ireland or Religious Ireland. It might have been the case at one time, certainly not today. People in this country have fallen away from religion, and the reason for that is because of the cover-ups of these religious orders. They were responsible for an awful lot. The abuse that people suffered at the hands of members of these religious orders. Now, that's not a subject I want to get talking about today, guys. There are still court cases going on, there are still investigations going on, there are still people coming forward and telling of their stories of the abuse that they suffered at the hands of members of these religious orders. Now, thankfully in the last couple of years the religious orders have admitted that it was going on, but unfortunately it is a little bit too little too late on their behalf. They have begun to name members of the religious orders that they knew was responsible for this abuse, but unfortunately they're naming people that have already passed away, so it's a little bit too little too late. But at least they have admitted, and they have admitted that they knew about it. But all the way up through the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s and 60s and 70s and into the 80s, that was the case, guys. The country was pretty calm, people were getting on with their lives. The 60s came along, and like all countries around the world, a good few countries around the world, the civil rights movements were out looking for equality for people. Up in Northern Ireland it was exactly the same. The Catholics wanted equality. There was a lady in 1969 in Northern Ireland, Bernadette Devlin. She's still alive. Bernadette Devlin was her name. She got involved in politics at 19 years of age. She also got involved in the civil rights movements, and she was organising peaceful rallies right across Northern Ireland in 1969 through 70 and 71 and 72. Peaceful rallies. She was calling on Catholics to come out and rally peacefully for equality, and they did. And when she made the call to the Catholics, they came out in their thousands every weekend right across Northern Ireland in one town or another. But these rallies began peacefully, but unfortunately before long they turned violent, and the reason for that was the Protestants did not want the Catholics getting equality, so they came out, and all of a sudden they were killing each other. Literally killing each other. The British government had to be seen to be doing something about it. They deployed the British Army to Northern Ireland. When they arrived carrying guns and full battle uniform. They were sent to Northern Ireland, guys, to protect the Catholics. They had a very good relationship with the Catholics. We have film footage and photographs in our archives of young Catholic women in housing estates, Catholic housing estates in West Belfast, bringing out pots of tea and coffee and trays of sandwiches to the young British soldiers, the average age being 18 years of age at the time. They were only kids. When you look at the 18-year-olds today, guys, they're a hell of a lot more streetwise than what the young men were in the British Army back then. But that relationship didn't last too long. The 30th of January 1972, there was a rally in the second largest city in Northern Ireland called Derry City, and that afternoon when that rally was taking place, the British Army shot dead 13 Catholics. It was that day that the future and the history of this country changed. The 30th of January 1972. We call it in Irish history Bloody Sunday, although throughout history we've had a lot of Bloody Sundays. But 1972 was probably one of the worst. It's up there with the worst. 13 innocent Catholics shot dead. The Catholics turned their backs on the British Army. They wanted them off the streets and out of Northern Ireland then. But they were not taken out. All hell broke loose. The illegal paramilitary organisations popped their heads up, got more involved in what was going on, more involved in the violence. On the Catholic side it was the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. On the Protestant side, the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force. These were illegal paramilitary organisations. All hell broke loose. Day in, day out, shootings, killings, bombings and maimings. It wasn't just Belfast. Dublin was bombed in 1974. On numerous occasions over the following years, London was bombed. Birmingham, the west of England, was bombed. The British and the Irish government sat back and watched it happen. Now they did, after the incident in Derry City in 72, they did come together to hold talks to try and stop the violence, but unfortunately they did not go far enough. But what they did do was they banned journalists from reporting on what was going on in Northern Ireland. An awful lot of what went on was never actually reported on. And some of you who might be mature enough, I won't say old enough, but I will say mature enough to remember, probably on the TV news in the evening time or the radio at home in your own countries, you might have heard of what was going on in Northern Ireland. What you guys heard back then, guys, was only a tip of the iceberg of what was actually happening. A tip of the iceberg. The 70s we saw segregation, Catholics and Protestants right across the north of Ireland. You have to remember we had housing estates, mixed housing estates. One side of the road was Catholic, the other side of the road was Protestant. We saw walls being built up through the middle of housing estates. These were segregation walls. They later became known as peace walls. At one time in Northern Ireland there was over 300 of these so-called peace walls. We had factories in Northern Ireland in the 70s and the 80s where we had Catholics and Protestants working together, socialising together. When these walls went up, all of that stopped. Segregation. We had the factories. They put in one entrance for Catholics, one entrance for Protestants. When they worked on the factory floor, they spoke to each other. They had to. When break time came along or lunch time came along, there was one canteen for Catholics, one canteen for Protestants. When they went home in the evening time, they went home through the entrances they had come in through. And that's how bad the segregation got. You go into the little towns and the villages, the towns and the cities in Northern Ireland back then, guys, you looked around and all you saw was burnt out buildings, bombed out buildings and boarded up buildings. Out in the little country villages, we had Catholics and Protestants living side by side. Conflict did not come into their lives. They respected each other's backgrounds, religions, cultures. They socialised together, they helped each other, they worked together. They intermarried. When a Catholic married a Protestant in the 70s and the 80s and going into the early 90s in Northern Ireland, guys, if a Catholic married a Protestant or a Protestant married a Catholic, it was frowned upon by the illegal paramilitary organisations. Over 20,000 couples in the 70s, the 80s and the 90s. During that time, over 20,000 couples were burnt out of their new homes because they had married somebody of the opposite religion. 20,000 couples. Disgraceful. And what did the Irish and the British government do about it? Nothing. They sat back and they watched it happen. Even today, you hear in the media, the governments on either side of the Irish Sea, they talk about what was happening in the north of Ireland at that time. They say when the Troubles were taking place. That's what we hear from the governments, that's what we hear from the media. When the Troubles were taking place. During the time of the Troubles. What a load of bullshit that is. You come out of your house in the morning time, you jump into your car to go to work and you find out you have a flat tire or a flat battery. That's a little bit of trouble. But when you have people basically slaughtering each other in towns and cities, that's not trouble, that's conflict, that's war. And that's what went on in Northern Ireland, guys, for nearly 30 years. During the 70s and the 80s in Northern Ireland, there was no new investment into the north of Ireland at all. There was no new industry. Anybody who had a job was very, very lucky. But jobs became scarce because the paramilitary organisations were targeting people going to and coming from work. They were being shot dead on the side of the street. People were afraid to go to work. Out in the little country villages, they said we would have safety in numbers. What they used to do, they would hire a little minibus, 16, 20-seater minibus. And the Catholics and Protestants from the village would go to work together. They would travel to work together. They thought they were safe. But the illegal paramilitary organisations began targeting these little minibuses, hijacking them, taking the occupants out onto the side of the road and executing them on the side of the road. And that's what they were doing. They were executing their own people because they were travelling to work in a bus with somebody of the opposite religion. Absolutely crazy. And again, the Irish and the British government did nothing about it. They sat back and they watched it happen. So when we point the finger of blame to what was going on in this country during the 70s, the 80s and the 90s, we have to say the Catholics were wrong. The illegal paramilitary organisations on the Catholic side were wrong. The Protestants were wrong. The illegal paramilitary organisations on the Protestant side were wrong. But just as much to blame as anybody else were the Irish and the British governments. They were as wrong as anybody else, because they sat back and they watched it happen, and they let it happen. Disgraceful. The 1990s came along, 93, and who arrives into Dublin one Tuesday morning? The American President, Bill Clinton. He arrives into Dublin, gives a speech in government buildings. That afternoon he gave a speech to almost 20,000 people in the middle of Dublin city centre. Nobody knew what he was doing that evening, what was on his itinerary, but he had made a request to meet the leaders of the illegal paramilitary organisations in Northern Ireland. He wanted to try and make some sense of what was going on in this country from 1969 until 1993. They had all agreed to meet. He was brought to Belfast. We don't know exactly where the meeting took place. We know the meeting did take place, but we couldn't tell you where. Mr. Clinton must have had a magic wand in more ways than one, because when that meeting had finished, all of the leaders of these illegal paramilitary organisations had said yes to peace talks. They were going to sort it out. They were going to sit around the table and talk about it and sort it out. Mr. Clinton had to go back to America. He was, after all, the US president. We don't actually know this either, but maybe at the time, just maybe at the time, Monica Lewinsky was in the Oval Office waiting on him. And for those of you who do not know who Monica Lewinsky is, Google her. You'll be surprised. But he appointed a guy called George Mitchell to come to this country. George Mitchell was a former US Senator, Irish background, Irish roots. Knew the lay of the land, was a regular visitor here, has family here, still has family here today. But he came to this country to oversee the peace talks in 93. He was still here in 98 and there was no deal. So he wanted to go home, he was getting tired, so he brought the people involved in the talks into a room. He says, get the fingers out, lads, I'm going home in 5 weeks' time, 6 weeks' time. If you don't have a deal done, yeah, back to square one. The shootings and the killings and the bombings and the maimings. So within 6 weeks they had a deal done. They started talking. The talks went on 24 hours a day. Never stopped. They were taking shifts. So the talking never stopped. Within 6 weeks they had the deal done. The deal was a power-sharing government in the north of Ireland, Catholics and Protestants in that government. The British Army were to be called off the streets, taken into barracks. The border checkpoints between the north and the south of Ireland were all to come down. They did. You go into the north of Ireland today, there's no such thing as border checkpoints, passport control, no visas needed. We have ease of travel. 1 minute you were driving up towards Belfast, 1 minute you're in the Irish Republic, next minute you're in the north of Ireland. Two separate jurisdictions. No passport control, no border control. You wouldn't know that you were leaving the Irish Republic and you're heading into a separate jurisdiction. There's a sign on the side of the road and that's it. So the border checkpoints came down. The last point of the deal was to do with the illegal paramilitary organisations. They were to be all disbanded, all their guns and ammunition were all to be decommissioned. But there was one last point of the deal, and both governments on the Irish side and the English side of the RSC disagreed with it. But they needed the agreement of both governments for this deal to work. Both governments did not agree to the last point. So they were brought into a room and they had their heads banged together and they were told, you had an opportunity back in 1972 to stop what was going on in Northern Ireland and you didn't go far. Two governments began talking about the final point of the deal. The final point of the deal was members of these illegal paramilitary organisations who had been in jail in Ireland, England, Scotland and Wales, within 3 years of the signing of the deal, they were all to be released from prison. Eventually both governments said yes to it. They had agreement eventually, and the deal was signed on Good Friday of 1998. Hence the name, the Good Friday Agreement. For the first time in nearly 30 years, peace fell across these islands. The good people of Northern Ireland could leave their homes and walk down the street not having to worry or look over their shoulder at who was walking down the street behind them. The North of Ireland, guys, was reborn in 1998. And thankfully today, we are still living in that peace. So George Mitchell oversaw the elections that year. He oversaw the new government when they were put in place. It was the Protestants in Northern Ireland had a majority in the government. The political party representing Catholics is called Sinn Féin. They were once the political wing of the IRA. They were the leadership of the IRA. But they gave a commitment to the people of this country coming into those elections that they would turn their backs on the bombs and the shootings and the killings and the maimings. And that's exactly what they did. Now, it was a very, very bumpy road for that power-sharing government, guys. A very bumpy road. On numerous occasions over the following years, the government collapsed. They had their disagreements, but they always got back around the negotiating table and got back to the business of the day, and that was to have a power-sharing government in Northern Ireland. And all of a sudden, guys, we are up now till 2016, 9 years ago. Very recent. What happened 9 years ago? Well, over in the UK, they decided that they wanted out of the European Union. Brexit, as it became known. They voted. That's the way the vote went over in the UK. They wanted to leave, but the North of Ireland, they wanted to stay. The vote went the opposite direction. And that gave the British government another headache. What are we going to do with Northern Ireland? All of a sudden, 4 years later, 2020, they come up with a deal. It took them 4 years to strike a deal with the European Union regarding Northern Ireland. 2020, the protocol deal was born. Now, what this protocol deal was, it said that even though the North of Ireland would not be a part of the European Union for the sake of jobs and industry and trade, they could remain trading as if they were, but on paper they were not a part of the European Union. It just meant there was no extra levies or taxes on goods coming in or leaving Northern Ireland. There was no extra border checks on goods coming into or leaving Northern Ireland. So basically, they were still operating as if they were a part of the European Union. The government of the day in 2020 up in the north of Ireland was not very happy about it, but they were told, this is the deal, accept it. They had to. They were told by London. The head of the government then in Northern Ireland was a fellow called Geoffrey Donaldson, the leader of the biggest political party representing Protestants in the north of Ireland, the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party. But he went along with the deal because he was told basically to do it. 2 years later he said, nah, we've had enough of this. He felt that Protestants in the north of Ireland were losing their identity. They were still being recognised as being Irish, still being recognised as being European. He didn't want that. So he called time on the government. Using this as an issue in a general election, he went to the people. And when the votes in that election were counted in 2022, he basically shot himself in 2 feet, not just one. So, when the votes in that election came back, the Catholics had the bigger numbers. They had the majority in the new government, or were going to have the majority in the new government, but he decided that he would not agree to a new government. 2 out of 3 political parties on the Protestant side said yes, we will agree, but Mr. Donaldson's party said no. So what we had then was a standoff, where he said, no, I'm not going into government with you. We had that standoff for 2 years where we didn't have a government in Northern Ireland, guys. During the time of that standoff, he basically he held the people of Northern Ireland as a ransom to the British government for them to go back and renegotiate the protocol deal of 2020. During that standoff as well, he came out with a couple of statements. He said he would not answer to a Catholic at the head of the government. He wouldn't bow to a Catholic. It was beneath him. He also said at the time He wanted it written into British law that the north of Ireland would always be a part of the United Kingdom. Now, when he came out with that statement, the press in Northern Ireland, they had a field day. They said the man was delusional. Time would tell. So, late in 2023, he got his way. The British government went back, they renegotiated the protocol deal of 2020. Today, that deal is called the Windsor Framework. But Mr. Donaldson still was not happy on some of the issues to do with that new deal. He wanted clarification on certain. In January of 2024, he got his clarification, which opened the doors for new power sharing government to be set up in Northern Ireland. But I did say that he wouldn't bow his head, or he wouldn't stoop or answer to a Catholic at the head of the government. So instead of going into that government himself, he put another member of his political party into that government in his place. The lady's name is Emma Pengelly. She is now the Assistant First Minister of Northern Ireland. He has taken a step to the side. The leader of the government today in Northern Ireland is a lady called Michelle O'Neill. She is Catholic. And the two ladies, when they were sworn in, they gave a commitment to the people of this country and the British Isles over in the UK that they would work for all communities. And they are doing that. And to be quite honest, the word is that ladies are doing a very, very fine job indeed. As regards Mr. Donaldson, well, in the last 15 months, Protestants in the north of Ireland have said that he has disgraced them. He was told to resign as the leader of his political party. If he didn't, he was going to be sacked. He did resign, but then they went one further and they expelled him from his political party. The reason for that is because he is currently awaiting trial on sexual abuse and rape charges. Now, he was meant to be in court, not just him by the way, but also his wife. Protestants in the north of Ireland have said that he has disgraced them. The trial was meant to happen in February of this year. It was put off till June, and then it was put off till July. It was meant to happen in August, and only during the week we have been told that it's now going to be November. Now, Mr. Donaldson has not been seen in the last 7 or 8 months. He's in hiding. They say his wife is not fit to stand trial because of mental illness, and he is currently in hiding. And the reason for that is because during the time of the conflict in Northern Ireland, the illegal paramilitary organisations had a reputation of dishing out their own punishment. If they thought you were due a punishment, they would give it to you. And these punishments came in the form of punishment shootings. You would be dragged out of your bed in the middle of the night, dragged off to a forest or a field up the road. They would blow your elbows off and your ankles off and your kneecaps off. It has been suggested to me that Mr. Donaldson will be very, very lucky. And this is from people I know in the north of Ireland, and I would know quite a lot of people because I'm up there 3 or 4 times a week. But I've been told that Mr. Donaldson is currently in hiding because he's fearing for his life. He will be very lucky to see the inside of a courthouse. So what can I say? Watch this space. But we have come so far, guys, in the last 27 years as regards the friendships between Ireland and England and the history of this country. We're in a much, much better position today than what we were 27 years ago. The late Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth II, she was queen for 75 years and 214 days, I think, something like that. But she had, during her time as queen, she was in every town and city and village in Northern Ireland. She was never in the Irish Republic until 2011, and when she came to Dublin in 2011, she was welcomed with open arms. She was the guest of honour at a state dinner in Dublin. She got up to give a speech, and when she started that speech, she was speaking Irish. Now, you might remember the scenes being flashed across TV screens across the world. Nobody in the room could believe it. There was dignitaries and celebrities and politicians and journalists and ordinary everyday people in that room that evening when she was the guest of honour at that state dinner. She stood up and here she was speaking Irish. She started the first lines of her speech, the first sentences of her speech were Oscuelga in Irish, or Gaelic. It's unfortunate to say that during her visit to Dublin that we did have some brain dead, and that's the only way to describe these people, as brain dead young people. And they were out on the streets of Dublin protesting to the fact that the Queen was in Dublin at all. And these were the same brain dead young people wearing football jerseys of two of the biggest English football clubs there are, Manchester United and Liverpool. They were out on the streets of Dublin wearing their team jerseys, protesting to the fact that the Queen of that country, where their clubs are based, is in Dublin. How brain dead is that? They probably go to England a couple of times a year to watch their teams play, and here they were objecting to the Queen of that country being in Dublin. I don't understand it. But basically, guys, that's where we are today as regards peace and politics and history in this country. We've come a long way in the last 27 years. We cannot change the past, but we can change the future, and we are changing the future. We have schools in this country that nowadays, north and south, religion doesn't come into the curriculum at all. They're not being taught religion in these schools, and we have kids of all cultures and backgrounds and religions and skin tones going to school together. And that is the way forward. They are learning to respect each other's cultures, backgrounds, religions and skin tones. And that is the way forward. Now, it is unfortunate to say, you know, that education is early, and we still have people who don't think like that in this country whatsoever. And they don't want immigrants coming into this country, and they don't want people of different skin tones coming into this country, which is terrible. I have to apologise for my fellow Irishmen, because they are just ignorant. People come to this country to make a better life for themselves, and in my book they're very, very welcome. So that's where we are, guys, as regards peace, conflict, history. That has been a synopsis of Irish history. Hasn't been everything, but it has been the most important points, and I hope it has given you an insight of where we have been in this country, where we have come from, the dark ages, the dark days of the past, and hopefully where we are going, the bright days of the future for everybody. For the sakes of the kids coming up behind us, the yet to be unborn on this island, no matter where they're from, no matter where their parents are from, no matter what skin tone, religion, cultures or backgrounds, we are trying to make this country a better place for them. And hopefully we'll be able to do that. I know we are trying, we're trying hard, but it will take time. So that's where I'm going to leave the history for the moment, guys. I'm going to let you guys sit back and relax a little bit, because I need a drink. Hopefully you're all okay. Are you all historied out? Oh, the silence says it all. Are you all asleep? By the way, I was just talking to keep myself awake, you know. Come on, I'll talk to you in a bit. During the course of the day, guys, you may see some fancy sports cars, supercars. At the moment in this country we have the Irish Cannonball Run. There's lots of supercars and sports cars. They come out and they do a tour of Ireland for charity, and it's on at the moment. And there's two of them just after passing us, so I didn't know it was down this way today, but obviously it is. They left just outside of Dublin yesterday, and they headed west, and obviously they overnighted probably down around Killarney. I don't know where they stayed overnight, but more than likely there's people out obviously watching to see the sports cars coming through, so we're going to see quite a lot, I would say. And it's all done for a charity, a children's hospice charity called the Jack and Jill Foundation. And 2 years ago we took part in it, myself and a buddy of mine who has emigrated to Australia. Believe it or not, he's only 30 odd years of age, but he has decided to go off and live in Australia. But hopefully we'll see a few more of the big supercars. There's a fella in a Range Rover. That's not so super. Why you drive one of them yourself? So that's the reason why all the supercars are around, and we'll see them over the course of the day because of the Cannonball Run, all in aid of charity, the Jack and Jill Children's Hospice Foundation. Porsches and Mercedes and Aston Martins and things like that. Back about 3 or 4 years ago, the police all over Ireland, when the Cannonball Run was taking place, they gave out more speeding tickets to the participants than ever. That was about 2 or 3 years ago. They gave out lots and lots of speeding tickets. downside of it, the guys who are driving some of these cars, the testosterone gets the better of them and they just drive like lunatics. Seen any electric cars that no EVs on it. I wonder why.